Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today, after months following my time reading Red Rabbit, I finally circled around to its sequel, which means that now it is time to actually review its sequel, because, I read it, and the first book is actually one of my better performing reviews, surprisingly enough. I'm not entirely sure why that one is, but it is a book that I was excited to read, and I'm glad I was able to scratch off before turning into 2026. But more than just glad to read it, I gotta say, Rose of Jericho was a little bit of a strange experience for me. Was that a good one? Was it a bad one? A straight up ugly and conflicting one? Let's discover all of that right now, starting off with the way that I normally start reviews. The good. What did I think was good about Rose of Jericho? Well, the first thing I gotta say is that it starts off super strong. Coming off the heels of Red Rabbit, there's a little bit of space in between them. I don't know how much time actually occurs between these two books, for sure, but coming off the heels of Red Rabbit, there's a lot about the start of this book that is super strong. It returns to a familiar character in there and has the tones and the vibe, that Red Rabbit sells are super on point at the beginning of this book. The air of tragedy abounds pretty early on in the book, so if you were into the way that Red Rabbit handled tragedy, the beginning of this actually does a pretty similar thing as far as that's concerned, and I honestly really liked that. I was really into this from the get-go. I also gotta say, generally the new setting and the new characters in this book are great. There's multiple early mysteries that are set up on account of the setting and trying to bring some characters together, and also just in the new setting in general, there's some questions that are raised about what it is that the people here are doing and where certain why there is a history in the town that most of this book takes place in becomes a big question of the book, and exploring that is something that Rose of Jericho does a lot, and I think did pretty well for the most part. Also, general warmth and then the coldness of different folk, of side characters and stuff like that, are really good. Many of the side characters for Rose of Jericho are new characters compared to Red Rabbit. There are a handful of returning main characters from Red Rabbit, but for the most part, everybody in here is new, and they're all pretty distinct. That's something I don't remember if I commented on that in my Red Rabbit review, but Alex Grecian does a pretty good job of making each character pretty notably different in these two books, both of them. That's no less true in Rose of Jericho than it was in Red Rabbit, assuming I even said that in that review. I probably didn't, I don't remember, but it is something that makes it pretty engaging to be in this world and to actually engage with it and with these characters, because they're just so enticing. I really enjoyed being able to follow them. Furthermore, the utilization of the old characters mixed with the new characters in that kind of context is also quite good. I think that in the main new setting, the town that most of this book takes place in particular, the dynamics between all the characters there are really good, and furthermore, the dynamics between all of the new characters amongst each other, not even necessarily in context of the returning characters, just straight up the new characters. All the character dynamics here, really, really great. I enjoyed a lot of that material, and you really are just kind of sold on the feelings of all the characters. Like I told you, that Grecian makes them all very distinct, very identifiable. They're all really engaging, and a lot of that is because you just kind of understand who they are, their motivations, their feelings, and more importantly, in the case of some of those characters, understanding how those motivations and feelings change as a result of a big major plot point early in the book is something that's really interesting and intriguing to follow. And that kind of takes us into the way that the supernatural aspect of this world is handled. If you watched my review of Red Rabbit, you know that was maybe my favorite thing about that book, was the way that ghosts and other, supernatural stuff of that type are handled in that book is incredible. And the way that that kind of general realm of ideas in Rose of Jericho is handled is mostly also pretty great. I think that the way death is handled here is really intriguing. Many ideas surrounding this aspect also throughout are good, kind of like what I was saying with the way that certain character dynamics change. That's as a result of some of the supernatural ideas in the book, and that's all really interesting. And the way that this works just kind of forming itself all together the way that it did in Red Rabbit is generally pretty awesome. But we're going to go into the bad with kind of the same type of topic, because even though there's a lot about the supernatural stuff that I did enjoy in Rose of Jericho, the supernatural side of the story does take a twist, regarding the main conceit revolving like death and stuff like that, I would say in the end didn't fully satisfy me. I wasn't wholly into it by the time the book finished. I don't mind religious or quasi-religious themes in my books. In fact, I tend to really like and appreciate a lot of them if they're not handled, disingenuously, for example. I would say that Alex Grecian did make an honest effort at doing something really cool and interesting with a sort of maybe theologically tinged aspect of the supernatural within Rose of Jericho that is like, it starts off really cool and you're just like, okay, I'm interested in seeing what he does here, but I do think good portions of it end up being a bit heavy-handed and unfortunately ended up kind of not rubbing me the wrong way per se. It's not like it really like that I disliked it, but there were aspects I was just like, okay, I wasn't as into the execution of some of these things that I feel like I should have been or that I would have liked to have been, for example. So that's more of like just a slight disappointment side of things. There's a lot of the beginning of this book that I really enjoyed, like I said before, and the back half of it, I would say like the final third of it mostly, I wasn't as into, we shall say. Furthermore, while I would say that character dynamics overall throughout the book are pretty great, they do get a little bit hammed up. I talked about the way that certain characters, their feelings and kind of what they're doing, their motivations, everything kind of changes a little bit throughout the book. In some cases this works perfectly well. In some other cases it feels like a little bit too much too quickly. There's a little bit too much of a shift in regard to how some of these things are handled. To a degree, obviously this is pretty intentional. I think that given the conceit with regards to death in particular, it makes sense, but I just felt like, again, some of these ideas ended up feeling a little bit more like mechanics, quote unquote, rather than like, an explorative idea. So I think that, I guess to kind of summarize how I feel about both the supernatural and the character dynamic side of things, the way that Alex Grecian handles a lot of this, I think it lacks subtlety. I think Rose of Jericho lacks a good bit of subtlety that Red Rabbit had, where Red Rabbit was a little bit more like, kind of, it held off from over-explaining things. It's not even like Rose of Jericho over-explains anything. I know I'm doing a really poor job of explaining this. I guess it's just that some ideas, some topics, some things that Alex Grecian does in Rose of Jericho don't fully sit or feel right in the end, I guess. I think there's a lack of subtlety. They're a little bit hammed up. They get a bit heavy-handed, I guess. And in general, like I mentioned, the last third of the book, I feel like it kind of lost the spirit of the first half mostly as a result of this. I feel like it just did a little bit too much, changed a little bit too much. I don't know if this would have been better if like the book had a little bit more runtime, if it was a little bit longer to ease some of those changes a little bit more. I'm not sure because, Red Rabbit was like 250 pages longer than this book is. So I don't know if like extra runtime would have helped or anything like that. I really just don't know. I think that particularly structurally, Alex Grecian doesn't give himself enough time to actually execute on that last third the way that I think the book probably needed, because there's a little bit of a timing element that goes into the plotting of the book, and I think that holds back the pacing as a result of more or less requiring it to be rushed to a degree. So I guess how I felt about Rose of Jericho because of some of this stuff was it kind of disappointed on some of it being a sequel to Red Rabbit. And I guess I'll go ahead and take that point to jump off into the ugly here and say that I'm not entirely sure why Rose of Jericho needed to be a sequel to Red Rabbit. Like, it's fine. It overall works generally. I think that the execution is pretty messy, but at the same time, I almost would have preferred this if it was something different in a weird way. Like, conceptually, there's a lot of what it's doing within the Red Rabbit world that, like I said, does make sense, and it is understandable why it is set in this world with some of these characters, but at the same time, it felt like certain ground rules were a little bit run over by what this does, particularly on the supernatural side of things, which is like, okay, that's a really interesting conceit. Let's see how it goes. And while I liked a lot of those ideas, and I liked how a lot of it was explored through much of the book, I think in the end, I ultimately came out wondering why this had to be a sequel to Red Rabbit and why it wasn't just its own standalone thing. Would I have read this book if it wasn't a sequel to Red Rabbit? All things consider probably not, because I probably wouldn't have really realized it was a thing or been super interested in it. For example, I'm not particularly inclined to read a whole bunch of Alex Grecian's other stuff. Like, I might at some point, but it's not a priority. So it being a sequel to Red Rabbit is a lot of why I read this. So, you know, I have to consider that. But I also feel like my reception was definitely affected by some of the intent because of how I felt about Red Rabbit and what this ultimately ended up doing in accordance with it. Didn't feel like it fully meshed together as smoothly as it should have in order for me to feel like it all clicked. You know, all that intent seemed to be the supernatural expansions that Grecian was doing in Rose of Jericho, which ultimately didn't satisfy for me personally. So, jumping into the recommendation, I probably sound like I'm pretty negative about this book, and, you know, I didn't love it. I don't want to sound like I hated it or like I disliked it, because, you know, there's a lot to like about Rose of Jericho, and the problem is that most of what I liked about Rose of Jericho was related to why I loved Red Rabbit so much, and as such, you know, if you really loved Red Rabbit like I did, I think that Rose of Jericho is worth a try. There's a chance that what it's doing clicks a little bit better for other people than me. I think this is topically one of those sets of ideas that I think is going to really depend on the person, how they actually react to it. There are probably people who would think that the way that Alex executed on a lot of these ideas is great, where I was like, a little heavy-handed for me type of thing. I don't know. But as far as a recommendation goes, I think that it is worth a try if you loved Red Rabbit, but I think that if you did not love Red Rabbit, or especially if you weren't super into it in the first place, there's no chance that you'll like this any better. And I think that even if you did enjoy or even love Red Rabbit, that I would not consider Rose of Jericho necessary, and I guess that's kind of part of the ultimate issue. While I think some of the ideas are interesting and whatnot, Rose of Jericho is just kind of an unnecessary sequel. We didn't really need a sequel to Red Rabbit, though I was excited to see what that would be. I'm not 100% sure if I actually feel like I needed to read this book. So, like, I absolutely recommend Red Rabbit. Rose of Jericho is one that I think you can decide for yourself based off of how you react, but I'm not telling you that you should, like, you know, be going out and dropping other stuff in favor of reading this, especially if you didn't already really love Red Rabbit. If you did, it's worth checking out, but, you know, nothing to, like, break your TBR for, in my opinion. So that is that, and the second review of 2026 done. I hope you enjoyed this video. I didn't really think that both of these first two reviews were going to be kind of that supernatural horror-esque side of things, because I reviewed Firestarter by Stephen King last week, and although that's not like really that much horror going on in that book, it's mostly the supernatural thing, I didn't realize that I was doing these things back to back, and if I had, I would have reviewed next week's book first. And speaking of next week's book, I will be reviewing The Silmarillion next Tuesday. This Thursday is also going to be part 2 of my 2025 reading tier list, where I'll be talking about and ranking all 25 books that I read in 2025. So, yeah. If you're interested in that, I recommend that you check it out, and you'll have an idea of how I actually, like, felt and rank, you know, Rose of Jericho on that list compared to Red Rabbit. That'll be something that might be interesting to check out. In either case, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.